Good evening, welcome. I'm Sarah Fillmore, I'm the Chief Curator here at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, and I'm happy to welcome you all this evening to our conversation with Ursula Johnson. We're joining you this evening on Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And while Mi'kma'ki stretches across 5 Canadian provinces and an American state, we know that many of you are tuning in from near and far, so welcome. As October's Mi'kmaq History Month, we're grateful and excited to share space with local artist Ursula Johnson, who continues to work here with so much heart and generosity through the fields of art and culture. I want to acknowledge our sponsor, TD Bank Groups, as well as the work of my colleagues here at the AGNS for bringing this program to life. Now I want to introduce to you Ursula Johnson. Ursula was raised in Eskasoni First Nation in Cape Breton, which lays claim to be the largest Mi'kmaq community in the world. She was taught basket weaving by her great-grandmother, the renowned artist Caroline Gould. Ursula Johnson has exhibited work nationally and internationally since graduating from NSCAD University in 2006. Using performance and installation-based practices, Johnson describes her work as changing mediums based on who I'm talking to and what conversations I'm trying to have. Much of her work employs cooperative didactic intervention and is place-based, often collaborating with others. Johnson's been shortlisted for the Salt Spring National Art Prize in 2015, the Nova Scotia Masterworks in 2016. She won that same award in 2019. She was the recipient of the Natchison Foundation Reveal Indigenous Art Award in 2016, and also the winner of the Sobey Art Award in 2017. She's not been sitting around doing a whole lot of nothing. So I'd like to say welcome to you, Ursula, and thank you for the opportunity to share our conversation, which we've been having for years now with our friends, throughout the interweb in these strange COVID times. And I'm really grateful that we were able to pick up this conversation where we had a little false start a couple of months ago, but we're finding ourselves here. Strange thing about this platform is that with practice, everything becomes a little bit easier. So welcome and thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm assuming this one's my camera here. And thank all of you for coming out to listen to what we're talking about. And I'm not sure, is it interactive? Do people aren't asking questions?
Well, one of the things that I like is they can put a little heart on their screen, I think, if they like what they see.
Okay, good.
And if you don't like it,
so then
put a little heart there anyway, dang it.
So then they can give a thumbs up to like and subscribe to our Gallery Nova Scotia. Great.
Yeah, one of the first things I want to address, you say thanks for coming out.
Yeah.
And I think it's hilarious because we might be the only ones who are actually out.
Yeah.
The nice thing about this is that people can now, through this new technology, find themselves at home with their dog, with their kids, with their partner, with their meal, and enjoy this moment that we're having. And I'm grateful to that new kind of use of technology. But it's been very strange.
It's been super weird. I must say, I feel really fortunate because I'm kind of I don't know, I'm a self-professed tech geek. And so I'm all about the gadgets, about the computers, about the cameras and all that stuff. So I find when the time happened, when lockdown happened and everybody's in quarantine and nobody's allowed out and anything, and it's oh no, what do we do? There's a very heightened sense of anxiety that happened just generally overall. But then when people started to figure out, well, how do we get back to work and how do we work from home? I felt very lucky because it was something that I was very comfortable and I would say somewhat intermediate in having that knowledge with regards to working with media-based programming. But I know a lot of people had a really hard time with it. But one of the things that I find was really difficult on a personal level is as somebody who's a performance artist, and I use body and interaction of body in space with other bodies, then that was not there anymore. And that was the part that really kind of shifted things for me. And it's like, well, how do I still use body and the space between bodies to try to create? So it's definitely been a big shift in that way. So it's not necessarily the technology or the tools, but it's the process. And I'm sure a lot of artists and makers have had that same experience. So I know that I'm not alone in it. And I find that it's just looking at a new way of working and a new way of thinking about your process and your practices and the methodologies with which you're trying to engage these conversations with have been very difficult.
We talked a little bit with Brendan Fernandez a few weeks ago, who's also a performance-based artist, and that same sense of shifting and feeling the space and some of the loneliness and rethinking a practice through being forced to rethink a practice. But there's also something interesting about transitioning through these times, thinking about making work in isolation versus in community. And your work tends to look to the past. So I think, and this is my way of looking at it, some of the work that you've made is in conversation with work of previous generations, but it's also with work of community. So if we can go back to a first body of work that Robin Metcalf worked with you on, and think about the relationship that you had making baskets, the language of baskets, and your great-grandmother's work, and how that body of work kind of came to life and continues to inspire you.
Yeah, for sure. And so the work that we're thinking of is Megudedamin, which is it's a Mi'kmaq word. It means "do you remember?" But it can also be used as Megudedamin as a prompt of like you do remember, like telling somebody, you encourage them that they remember. So a lot of my practice has to do with nostalgia, because nostalgia is a very big thing for me as a Mi'kmaq speaking person. The way that I was raised, so my first language is Mi'kmaq, and I think in Mi'kmaq. And nostalgia is very important because there has to be a recognition of what has come before, but also a recognition of what's about to come in the future. Because even though it's in the future, that's still nostalgia. So I find that work, Megudedamin, even though that show toured, for many years across the country, and it's done for quite a few years now, it has such an amazing legacy, but it looked at honoring my great-grandmother's way of making and her contributions that was intrinsically related to the Mi'kmaq language. And the words of the processes was etched into these cases. And the word, is kind of like a scientific kind of description, as if it was a biological dissection. But that word, if you break it down, it actually is an instruction that tells you what to do with your body in these materials. So if it was only the words that were on that case and there was no image of a basket, a Mi'kmaq speaking person would read those words and it would be like a recipe that told them what to do with their body in these materials. So that project had many other components with regards to looking at ideas of conservation, because these cases are, empty, as they say. There's nothing in there. The art is the case, but the importance of that is the memory that's inside the case, because we don't see memory, right? It's an invocation that needs to happen. And in Mi'kmaq language, that invocation is very important, because for us, Mi'kmaq is our political name. It's our political identity. We are a Mi'kmaq nation at the United Nations or within Canada. That's our political name, is Mi'kmaq people. But for us, ourselves, we are Ulnu, Ulnu. That's what we say, Ulnu. And it comes from Ntlnu, my tongue. So what it means is that everything that I think, I feel, that comes off my tongue, I'm responsible for. and nobody else. I can't hold you or anybody else responsible because that's your thoughts, your words, your actions. But if I'm responsible for what I say and do, you're responsible for what you say and do, they're responsible for what they say and do, you're responsible for what you say and do, then all of us together create a society where we work together in a very responsible way and in a sustainable way. And I find that Mi'kmaq people were philosophers first, politicians second, and then comedians last. Because, you know, you have to really kind of find a fine balance between those ways of working. And when you look at things that are happening, you know, especially within our province right now, with the Mi'kmaq fishermen and the disputes that are happening on the south shore of Nova Scotia, you can see that those people, the Mi'kmaq fishers, even if some of them don't have their language, those values of their intrinsic responsibility for sustaining themselves, their communities, holding their dignity, not lashing out in violent situations, you can see all of that ties in directly to who they are in those people. They're not just Mi'kmaq people, they're Ulnu, right? They have that responsibility and they're responsible for it. So I find that that show was a really great way to take the ideologies of Mi'kmaq people and to take it all over the country. But the thing that was most important for me is not just to take our ideas and, you know, kind of prance them around, but every community we went to, because we went into Blackfoot territory, Anishinaabe territory, Tsleil-Waututh territory, all these different territories of different Indigenous peoples, it was important to me to have a connection with those communities and to say, am I allowed to bring my ideas from my nation into your community? And they're like, yes, absolutely. What do you want to talk about? And then I tell them it's about nostalgia, it's about making with hands, it's about community, it's about culture, it's about revitalization and survivance. Then they say, great, these are the things we're doing. And then those art galleries then worked with the communities together so that they could share space, they can celebrate together, because then those art institutions and then those Indigenous institutions came together to try to reformulate the idea of what community is together. So I'm very proud of that exhibition because it had, you know, that opportunity to create change. And there are some places that I touch in from time to time, and they have after-school programs for the Indigenous communities and the art galleries and vice versa. So I think it was a very successful project overall. That was a bit of a long answer, sorry.
I think it led so nicely for someone who stands beside and is interested in watching the conversation and participating in the conversation. It led so beautifully into the work that you engaged in Cape Breton for the project of reallocation and talking about the work that we can do to be stewards of the land. And you really do think about as a politician, as a diplomat in many ways, and as a promoter or as a producer in other ways, of bringing together various voices to create a conversation that's multi-layered, but respectful of other ways of speaking, other languages, other ways of making, other ways of performing. It was one of the moments in my life where I was witness to something that was extraordinarily special and extraordinarily grounded in a place that felt open to that kind of conversation. And what I was surprised by was that it came out of a kind of age-old conflict. So maybe could you bring us through some of the thinking that you that led you and your team, and it was a huge team for that project,
team, yeah.
with this under this umbrella of a celebration for Canada's 150 and what that might obviously politically might have meant to you. How that project took shape and then has had this incredible life since.
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely a huge team that came together, and there was so many people that were possible, that made it possible, I should say. And the same thing happened with Megadedaman too. There was, I would say, probably close to 40 people that were involved in the creation of Megadedaman. And then
that's the thing that we never, that is the thing, not to interrupt you, and I apologize for that, but these moments of like, you know, solo show or a solo project, I'm always, you know, there's always such an incredible team that actually lets you or holds you or builds with you, and
you learn from, like, I've learned from so many people that I work with. I'm of the mind of like, well, if I'm not a metal worker, I'm not going to try to learn a skill to try to make something that has metalwork in it. But like, you're a professional at what you do, let's collaborate together. This is an idea I have, you know how it needs to be done and whatever. So it just, I think it's, personally for me, it's really important to have those relationships and those collaborations, and very open and fluid, and to have like that push and pull.
And because you're saying metalworker because you had an ironsmith build you.
Yeah, absolutely.
A kind of
it was a huge
cradle?
Well, it was
fire cradle.
So that's the perfect place to actually start to talk about reallocation, because reallocation was the Festival of Stewards was the event that took place. And this Festival of Stewards there was a big feast, because you have to have a feast at a festival. And this feast was cooked, it was moose kebabs, along with a number of other traditionally Acadian and Gaelic foods that were on this menu for this feast. The menu, I must say, was actually designed by a number of students from the elementary and junior high school in Neils Harbor. Shout out to Neils Harbor in Cape Breton. And those students, we said, well, if we were going to have a festival, what are we going to serve to make sure that the Acadian community and the Gaelic community are represented in the foods that would have been. And then somebody was like, oh, my grandma used to make fish cakes all the time. We're like, great, we'll put fish cakes on there. So it was, the whole menu was developed based on history. And the main course was these moose kebabs. And it was moose that was harvested in the highlands, actually just probably like 3 kilometers from where the feast was. And the moose was very generously donated by KMKNO, which is the Gwilimok Negotiation Office. And it was the moose harvest that had happened in the Cape Breton Highlands, you know, the contested moose harvest that created tensions, again, between the Mi'kmaq and the non-Mi'kmaq community about practicing treaty rights, about first right to resource, about harvesting, hunting, fishing, you know, all these things, they're always there. So this was looking at that relationship, but also the relationship that existed before that conflict. The relationship of the Acadian and the Gaelic community and the Mi'kmaq community coming together for hundreds of years prior to Canada existing. Because this was in the context of the Landmarks Project, which there was multiple artists across Canada that were commissioned to create public works. And these public works were to celebrate Canada 150. So I went to the Cape Breton Highlands, to this elementary and junior high school, and I told the kids who I was. I showed them some slides, and you know, we chatted a little bit. And then they said, so then what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to do whatever you guys want to do. I said, let's have conversations. And we talked about the conflict that was happening present day at that time. We talked about how some of these children had stories from their grandparents where their houses were burnt down while they were out fishing, so that when they came back, they had no homes and they were forced to leave. So we looked at ideas of being relocated. We looked at allocation of resources. We looked at the real relationships that happened between people. And they said, well, let's make a festival with Acadian singers, with Gaelic singers, with Mi'kmaq singers. We'll bring everyone together, because those relationships existed in a very sustainable format. Everybody had their own little piece of the island, and they lived together and they worked together and they thrived.
And you said these are grade 4?
These were kids between the ages of like, I think the youngest one was 10, and the oldest one was 14. So these are really sharp-minded kids. They're on the ball. They know what's what. They hear the conversations. They have their own thoughts. And it was an opportunity for them to talk about, what does this backyard to you? What does this mean? How are you going to relate to this land? So we came up with this idea of stewardship and how we could look at different practicing trends of stewardship. So we looked at the idea of like the superhero trend. And so there was these like superhero emblem that I had created in this design. But this design had come from photographs that I had taken from nature to create. And then the design had this shape in it that was like an S kind of shape, where it's like stewards of the environment, right? And these really poppy colors, which were actually the projected, according to like the Pantone color palette from Illustrator, they were the projected fashion trends for that coming season. And I was like, perfect.
Hot colors.
We use fashion, hot topics, hot trends, hot colors, smash them all together. These kids loved it. They went nuts over it. They're like, I want pajamas like that. I want sneakers like that. You know, they were all over it. And then I was like, well,
you did brand the bejesus out of it. It was amazing.
We did. It was
awesome.
Pretty good. Yeah. And, you know, there was aprons that the cooks had while they were cooking up this moose meat on the meat swing that was created at Firehouse Ironworks. You know, they made this giant meat swing. It was a barbecue that's 6 feet by 2 feet long. And it had, I think, over 300 shish kebabs on there, moose meat. But it just turned into this really, it was a day of celebration, celebrating the history and the relationships, but more importantly, celebrating these kids and what these kids, the experience that they were having, but the experience that they'll have in the future. And it will change the way that they relate to each other in those communities and to that land and to those resources.
I remember you saying that that age group was so important because there was the potential for real change. And that was, to me, an act of it was an act of faith, but it was activism in a way that felt like it was hopeful. And that seems to me that there is the power in your work to be dealing with politics at all levels. You know, politics through law, through festivals like that, through re-engaging tradition. And I remember that day there were, you know, games that were being played, that people were learning, games that were 100 years old and that were being reintroduced. But I'd like to go to the law and how this next body of work that has been ongoing really is profoundly embedded in history and in the law of the Indian Act. And the piece is called Il Nu Wuldig, and I think it's a really interesting way of dealing with conversations with the past, but also a potential to really bring to life issues that maybe are not as prevalent in, you know, as they are becoming.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, well, I find that there's something like reallocation was a very definitive, like a socially activist kind of work, right? Where people, the entire community was involved and working together. And often, I don't know, I find a lot of people think of things like social activism or even political activism and community activism in very different ways. You know, they think, oh, it's all the same thing, but it's not the same thing because there's very clear differences that happens, whether you're community engagement or your political activism by way of intervening into like judicial systems, like with Il Nu Wuldig, for instance, or if it's maybe a bit of a finer like socio-political activism on a grassroots level, like with these kids, for instance, because they'll talk about that, you know, for years to come with their parents and then hopefully their kids that follow along. But then when you look at the difference between all of those different things, one thing that I find was very important to me with the work of Vulnerability was to look at the idea of intervention, because there's things that you can do that's like a call to action for somebody, and you encourage them to look at something, to learn about it. But then there's something you can do where it's like a direct intervention. And that work was specifically designed initially through the Prismatic Festival that was hosted in Halifax way back in 2012, I think it was, when the first one that we did. And it was at the law school library. And in front of I think it was like I can't remember, it was at the Schulich School of Law, and I was standing out front, and I had put a call out to people, because I often work with, volunteers, bring them in, and we kind of work together. And so I had put the call out to people, asking if they felt comfortable to self-identify according to the membership codes of the Indian Act. Because the Indian Act is from long before Canada existed, and it's kind of carried throughout. But there's a policy in there that's actually an assimilation policy with regards to legislated identity. So there used to be over 117 ways in which somebody could be an Indian, right? Because those were the ways of which you could revoke the idea of somebody being a registered Indian. So it was a quite successful assimilation policy. And altogether, I think there was maybe over 200, but 117 that were successful. And then there's maybe about 7 to 11 that are still contested within the Canadian Supreme Court system to try to figure out, well, which ones are actually, the ways that are still considered to have registry. But the thing that I was really interested in was how the idea of legislated identity interrupted families and communities, but also who was responsible? Whose responsibility is it that comes all the way around? Is it the responsibility of the registered Indian? Is it the responsibility of the society? Is it the responsibility of the judicial system? So I thought, what better way to strike up this conversation than to have an intervention in front of the law school library? I invited people that self-identified, and then I would ask them, can I make a portrait of you? Because all people who have played a historical role have to have their bust portrait made. And the bust portrait is to commemorate them and what they do. However, this is all based on anonymity, because I know it's a very sensitive topic, and I don't want your portrait to be put all over the place and your likeness resembled. But it was also looking at the ideas of body and politics, and about the relationship between my body and their body, and also the body of these materials that I'm working with. So I would weave people's heads and shoulders with these ash materials in front of the law school library, because it wasn't necessarily a conversation between me and this person. Our bodies are working together to create a conversation, and it's the law students that are walking past that stop, and then they're like, what are you doing? And then I say, well, I'm making this person's portrait. And they said, but you can't even see them, their face is covered. And I was like, but it's still their portrait, it's their likeness, it's who they are. And then I would ask them, I said, are you familiar with the Indian Act? And they're law students, and they're like, yeah, of course. I said, and do you know about membership codes and registry? And then they're like, yeah, we're actually at that point in our semester right now. And I was like, perfect. So let's have a little conversation about it, because you are Canada's future lawyer and judge that is going to be making rulings based on the Indian Act with regards to how me, my family, my community, my entire nation, and all Indigenous peoples across this country relate to one another, but also how non-Indigenous people relate to our Indigenous bodies within this idea of legislated identity. I'm not trying to say this is right, this is wrong. I'm just trying to say there's something not right, something's not working. I don't know what it is, but if we stop tiptoeing around it and we just put all the cards on the table, we look at what's there, we have a very clear understanding that we're all coming as people who are responsible for what we're saying together, and then we engage in a conversation in a very sustainable and respectful way, then we can move forward and figure out what the problems are. So I find that work has been really evolving a lot, especially in this time right now where our bodies are, potential hazards to each other in this time of a global pandemic. Because I can't go up to somebody and start touching their body and working with them in close proximity. So there's some shifting that's going to have to occur with regards to doing that project. But it's a body of work that's ongoing, and we've made multiple bust portraits as time has progressed. And we've been working on looking at the idea of the public spectacle of creating this forum, or the intervention within a law institution or an educational format, but then also within the privacy of people's home. Because not everybody wants to have that conversation, in public or in front of a law school library. Some people want to participate in the project, but they just want to be at their kitchen tables where they're safe, or maybe they want their kids to be involved in the project.
You've taken the project outside of Nova Scotia and have engaged with communities in Newfoundland as well, and you're able to trace a very wide community and give voice across that. Are you finding? Our hope is that it continues as we continue to build the project. But are you finding that the feeding of those conversations and that relationship is expanding as you're in those different communities?
Absolutely, and we've made projects, or we've made portraits with that project, also in like Toronto, in Saskatchewan. We've gone everywhere in making so many of these bust portraits. My mission is to have 200 of them. At least 150, or maybe in 3 years' time, 156. Right. Commemorate each year type of thing, right? Whatever. The goal is 200 eventually someday. Because then it kind of talks about how many of these types of legislative identity existed. But in looking at all of these different places, no matter what province, whether it's status, non-status, urban, on reserve, off reserve, rural, nomadic, Métis people even, all of these individuals have participated in this project, and the opportunity that I have had to engage with them, there's definitely a common thread throughout all of it. And all of it is this idea of, kind of this thing that's imposed onto your body that tells you this is who you are, because this is how you've been legislated or how you've not been legislated, because that's also a very big thing. When you're told, no, this is not what you are, and then somebody says, but that's what I am. But who has the right? Is it government that has the right to tell somebody whether or not they're from a particular nation or a community? And at what point does that intervention take place that separates families from each other? It was an assimilation policy that was meant to break up families, to break up communities. And it's been extremely successful. And I find there's a lot of conversation and writing that can be done around that particular topic and that project. And it's never going to end. It's the same thing that's going to exist until the day the Indian Act is no longer there, or even in the wake of the Indian Act, that policy and that assimilation practices are still going to be there. So I find it's a project that's going to be relevant forever, and there's so many different places we can take that conversation to.
Well, let me ask you, as we wind our conversation down, I'm so grateful that you bring the conversation into the gallery, into museums, into places that have actively participated in harm, and this kind of conversation, difficult conversations with communities, that you are willing to challenge and bring the conversation to the places that still hold the history in a certain way. And can you just tell me, is it does it still matter? Does the museum structure still matter? Does the gallery still provide a place that allows for authentic conversation? And I might be opening myself up here to, to
the
hard
comment
conversation and go for it, because this really is a moment where our challenge is real and this structure is flawed. So to be able to have this kind of work in our walls directly in juxtaposition with a history that has marginalized, that has put boxes around everything. Why are you still willing to engage in that way? Are you still willing to engage in that way?
I'll tell you what. It's because I'm all new, and it's my responsibility. In short, that's all I can say.
Thank you.
But in long breath, I feel like it's extremely important for everybody to take that responsibility seriously. When I'm engaging in topics, no matter what the topic is, if I'm engaging in a topic as an artist, because that's what I do, I'm an artist, I use the vehicle of art to create that conversation and to incite a discussion. That is my goal. And it's the goal that I don't take very lightly. I devote so much time and energy and care into that responsibility, knowing that if I have something that I need to say, then who am I saying it to and why am I saying it? Because I just can't just take up the air and just say a bunch of things. There's somebody that has done or said something, or I read something, I research it, I learn about something, and then I'm like, oh, I want to engage in that conversation. But I'm an artist, so I engage through the vehicle of art. The vehicle of art is housed by art galleries and museums. Therefore, my conversation fits within the context of art galleries and museums. However, it also fits in within the container of education, because academia is also a part of that same institutional colonial structure that art galleries and museums fit within. So that container is my wheelhouse to have those conversations. But then there's also other wheelhouses for other conversations, like media, for instance. Media has a responsibility to be unbiased and to tell a story about what's happening. And there's a number of media outlets that take that responsibility, very seriously. There's a Mi'kmaq community member who's actually an independent journalist, her name is Maureen Gugu, and she has Gugu Quest News. I have just recently become a supporter of Gugu Quest News through her Patreon page. And Patreon, I'm just going to talk to these guys out here.
Yeah,
Patreon is amazing. You can support people, but artists, musicians, singers, dancers, they all rely on Patreon. So if you don't know about Patreon, look for Patreon. That's how you can support artists in present day. And if you can't go to a show and buy a ticket, you can, choose whatever way you want to support artists. So I support different media personnel that I know need that support so that they can tell their stories and uphold their responsibility. We support, myself and my wife, Angela Parsons. We work together and we support different artists in any way we can to support them, either emerging artists or by buying artwork from them or commissioning works. We support local communities. I feel like it's really important for all of us to look at our conversations and how they all fit with each other, because the important thing is once you know where your conversation fits and your responsibility in that conversation, then I find things work a bit better. And we are in a time now where Western colonial institutions like museums and galleries and universities are starting to kind of step back and be like, whoa, what's going on? What's happening? Because, these spaces often don't have windows to the outside world. And there's all kinds of, kind of philosophical roads we can go into about why they don't have windows. But we all know it's, because of light and conservation and all these different things. But now I feel like we're at a time not only in Canada, but throughout the entire globe, where people are starting to walk down those very dark hallways and they're going to the window and they're looking and they're like, OMG, there's something going on here, and what we're doing in these walls is not working. So we need to try to figure out what's not working. And people are mobilizing and moving together and having conversations facilitated. And I think the most important thing in all of our responsibilities, the institutions, the administration in those institutions, the artists that participate in those institutions, the public that engages in those institutions, the patrons, we all have a responsibility together to create a safe space to have difficult conversations. Because if we can't have difficult conversations in a safe space and we're lashing out at each other, then we're not going to get anywhere. That's my soapbox.
It's a good one, Ursula. Your work speaks volumes. I mean, you are one of the most erudite artists, and I appreciate your words. I appreciate how it translates through the work. I appreciate the way that you work with us, with all of your partners and all of your collaborators. And it's one of my professional points of pleasure to have you in my circle of friends and colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
I want to also just say thank you to you for agreeing to be part of the journey of the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia and just hold us in a really important moment. I want to thank again our sponsors, TD Bank Groups, for spurring and for providing support so that we can engage in this way through this platform. And I want to encourage you at home to engage with the gallery in whatever way you see fit to help us to answer questions that you're having, or pose questions, to come see art, to work with artists in your community, to find ways to see around you the work that artists are doing. This week we're hosting Nocturne in the city. Lindsay Dahman and many other people have been involved in this incredible project that is, it might be 10 years old now, this beautiful Nocturne. But it is it more than that? I'm so sorry. This is when you get older, time is sort of fluid like that. Thank God I'm still so young and good looking. I find what happens in Halifax and what happens in Nova Scotia to be second to nowhere. So thank you, Ursula. The conversation is always so short and so long, and I'm so glad that it continues. And thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Laura, and thank you to the team of our incredible technicians who provided us with both sound and video. And please keep tuning in and have a safe night.